Hi, my name is Juliet Selgren, and this is my podcast, The Great Antidote. This podcast has been brought to you by the Center for Growth and Opportunity at Utah State University. To learn more, visit www.thecgo.org. Welcome back. It is my pleasure today to be speaking to Colin Grabow. Colin is a policy analyst at Cato Institute at the Herbert A. Stiefel Center for Trade Policy Studies, where he focuses on trade protectionism, such as the Jones Act and stuff like that. And today we're going to be talking about the Jones Act. So welcome, Colin.
Thank you very much.
So first, before we jump into this quite ridiculous issue, I would like to say, what is the most important thing that people my age or in my generation should know that we don't?
Well, this is a difficult question to answer because I don't presume to know what people your age don't know. In fact, I'm consistently impressed by how knowledgeable many young people are. With that said, one thing I'd like to impart to young people is the importance of a somewhat counterintuitive concept called comparative advantage. The basic idea is by focusing on what you're relatively best at and then just doing that thing. That's what makes us all better off. My wife, for example, she is better than me in almost everything. But while she can iron somewhat better than I can, she can cook a lot better than I can. So I do the ironing and she cooks and we're both better off for it. All comparative advantage basically is people saying, hey, I got this. You go do that other thing that you're relatively better at and I'll do this thing. And that's true on a global scale and is what drives international trade. When we get that dreaded example of a factory closing and moving to Mexico, it's basically people in Mexico saying, hey, we got this. We'll make the cars or whatever. And you go focus on that other thing that you're better at than us. And that's good for everyone. And for Americans, that better thing can be any number of things, like designing the latest iPhone or making shows for Netflix or working in finance or healthcare or any other number of sectors that Americans excel at. I just urge that when people try to adopt that mentality or way of thinking when they read or hear about trade and increased imports and factory closures, jobs being shifted from one company to another or one country to another, it's not necessarily a bad thing. Actually, it's a good thing. It's just the economy constantly recalculating and reevaluating what we're all relatively good at and where our talents are best used. So that's my long-winded answer to your very short question.
I really like that answer. I don't know. I feel like I try to think about things like that, but I never have quite been able to. I don't know. I just never really had a good approach when thinking about, if a factory closes, how do you explain that in a way that it sucks for the people who lost their jobs, and I know they still have opportunity, but just thinking about it in that way, I don't know. It's so much nicer, but it's not that it's a false depiction of what it is. It's just more optimistic.
Yeah.
I don't know. I like it. I think that's good. That's something that people, especially now, don't do. So it's very important. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
So can you tell us first, before we jump in, what exactly is the Jones Act?
The Jones Act is the colloquial name applied to Section 27 of the Merchant Marine Act of 1920. And it basically imposes 4 conditions that have to be met for the transportation of goods by water from one point in the United States to another point in the United States. Basically, any vessel transporting cargo in the United States between 2 U.S. ports has to meet 4 conditions. And that's that the vessel or ship has to be registered and flagged in the United States. So just like you register your car in a certain state, well, you have to register your ship, in the United States. It has to be at least 75% crewed by Americans, and that remaining 25% can be permanent resident aliens, so green card holders. It has to be at least 75% U.S. owned. And then lastly, the vessel has to be built in the United States, which is an incredibly unusual requirement that we don't ask of any other form of transportation like airplanes, trucks, railroad, whatever, skateboards, any other means of transporting goods, you can buy it from wherever. But when it comes to things that transporting goods by water, for some reason, we've mandated it has to be built here in this country.
That, I don't know, that just seems like there are so many criteria there that, first, I mean, as you mentioned, you haven't seen applied to other methods of transportation, but also just that's so many requirements. You would think that you would not need that many to achieve the outcome you want. I don't know. It's just that's a lot. So boats from different countries can still enter U.S. ports, and they do. But how does it work? Let's say with the example of like if a French vessel carrying cheese enters a U.S. port in New York, but then also has to make a stop in Texas. So is that under the Jones Act not allowed? How would a company go about operating under those rules?
So what happens is often you do find ships will come over from Europe, say Rotterdam, for example, and what they will do is they will visit multiple U.S. ports, and they will drop off goods that originated from Europe, or they will pick up products destined for international locations. But you'll have a ship, for example, and it'll go to, say, New York. And then it'll head down to Virginia Beach or Wilmington. It'll go down to Charleston and maybe Miami. So it's going to all these different U.S. ports, and that's fine, but it can only, again, drop off products that started off in another country or picking up products that are going to another country. So on the one hand, that doesn't sound terribly restrictive, but on the other hand, it's a huge missed opportunity because we have these ships going from port to port to port, and it's a great opportunity for Americans to say, hey, you're heading down to Miami anyway. Can you take this piece of cargo with you and drop it off there? No, they can't. They're going there anyway, but it'll be illegal for them to transport that product. So in many ways, it's kind of like a conveyor belt operating along our coast that we're forbidden to use.
That's a good way. That analogy, the conveyor belt, that's a helpful visual, I think. I've read that shipping oil from Texas to the Northeast costs 3 times more than shipping oil from Africa to the Northeast, which I don't. That's insane. That thought is just crazy. Which is an extra cost that's shouldered by consumers, specifically consumers in the United States. So like you and me. Can you explain why that is and what other consequences there are of the Jones Act?
Yes, you can find multiple examples of products being shipped within the United States and being vastly more expensive to ship it within the United States than to ship internationally. There's the example of shipping oil from Texas to a refinery on the Mid-Atlantic costing 3 times more than sending that same barrel of oil on a non-Jones Act ship up to Canada, a greater distance. So that has any number of effects. Like you mentioned, one consequence is that Americans will pay more for gasoline, for example. But it has this highly distortionary effect on trade. What will happen is some of these refineries, well, instead of buying American oil, they will import it from, like you said, they'll buy it from Africa. They'll buy it from even Europe, say, oil produced in the North Sea instead, because even though the distances may be greater, once you factor in the cost of transportation, it makes more sense to buy the foreign product. This happens, there have been documented examples of this in, say, Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico, of course, being an island, has to bring in by ship most of what it consumes. And they have a choice of where to buy these things. In 2013, the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, did a study about the Jones Act's impact on Puerto Rico. And they talked to people in the agricultural community there, and they said, yeah, when we go to buy feed for animals or fertilizer, oftentimes we'll buy it from a foreign source instead of the United States, because even though, again, the distance is greater, be it from Canada or some other place, once you factor in the cost of transportation, it doesn't make sense to buy American. And then we get into these truly absurd examples where it can be actually impossible to buy American products because of the Jones Act. Again, if you look at Puerto Rico uses natural gas for about anywhere from 1/3 to 40% of its power generation. And they'd like to use more because that remaining 60%, a lot of that is oil and coal, obviously a lot dirtier. But they can't buy American natural gas because the ships to transport it don't exist. There are 96 Jones Act ships. And when I use the term ship, I'm saying large ocean-going ship. Tugboats don't count here. There are only 96 ships. Out of those 96, 0 are LNG carriers designed for the purpose of transporting LNG. So people in Puerto Rico can't buy American LNG, even though the United States is one of the world's leading producers of LNG. And that's not despite being part of the United States, but because it's part of the United States. If Puerto Rico was an independent country, it would actually make it easier for it to buy American products, which is completely crazy.
That is crazy because it's not even like it has a choice. That kind of, especially on the topic of like natural gases, is there an environmental aspect to the Jones Act and the way that because ships and boats, that causes less pollution than like cars.
Absolutely.
Right?
So yeah, if you want to move goods, one of the most efficient ways to do it is by water. Shipping by water is a carbon-friendly means of transporting goods relative to other modes like rail, particularly trucks, and absolutely airplanes. It's absurd difference there. Purely from a carbon perspective, we should be trying to move as much by water as possible. Also, just the amount of energy it consumes is less. So there's a lot of environmental reasons to try to shift as much of our transportation to water and away from land-based modes as we can. So the Jones Act also has other environmental aspects. Not only do we move less by water than otherwise would be the case, but the vessels that do operate are dirtier than would otherwise be the case because they're older. Why are they older? Well, again, we have that U.S. built requirement, and a U.S. built ship can cost, depending on the type of ship, a tanker tends to be about 4 times the global price, and a container ship is about 5 times the global price. So, instead of paying $50 million for a ship, you're paying $250 million for a ship. Well, what happens when you face those prices? Well, you hold on to your ships for longer. You really hate replacing your ships because it's a big expense. So instead of modernizing your fleet and your ships with the latest and greatest and newer ships, just like newer cars, newer airplanes tend to be more efficient, you have older, less efficient ships being used. So it hurts our environment and has negative consequences for several reasons. And lastly, we're in this place right now where the Biden administration is encouraging the use of offshore wind. And I'm not going to take a position on whether offshore wind is a smart approach, but it's the approach that is currently being pushed for. And if you want to do that, well, you need ships to do it. And the Jones Act raises the cost of installing offshore wind energy, and it makes it a less competitive source of energy. For example, there are specialized vessels needed to take these giant wind turbines and install them. Right now, there are 0 ships in the world that comply with the Jones Act. They're capable of doing that. There's one under construction in Texas right now, but it won't be ready till I think 2022 or end of 2023 rather, and it costs double what it would cost to build in South Korea. And so the only alternative they have is to use like a foreign ship that can sit there stationary, and then you have to use a barge to bring out the parts out to that stationary foreign ship. And it's just a crazy concept that adds on extra time, extra cost, and again, just reduces the competitiveness of this alternative form of energy.
And I'm also guessing that you'd need more than one ship.
Yes.
Like one more than the one that they're building. So if they were to comply with the Jones Act and then they were to build those ships, that would cost way more than even what it costs to build the initial ship, because you need more ships and then it takes more time. And then at that point, why not find an alternative that's cheaper and will take less time? That's kind of what we're facing. I don't know. I can't get over the fact that we have 96 big ships that are compliant with the Jones Act. That's so many. No, not so many. So few, but like, I don't know. What does it do to competition? I did not mean to say so many. That's okay. I don't know. What is that? What did the Jones Act do to, let me back up. Okay. So the Jones Act just turned 100.
Yes.
And in one of your writings, you note that, quote, that is, at best, an incomplete picture. The Jones Act's real story is far more sordid. To properly understand the law, one must first go back to the very founding of the Republic, end quote. And you note that Congress's first act was to encourage the use of American ships to carry U.S. commerce through the use of discriminatory taxes and tariffs, which wasn't a problem at the time because of the U.S. shipping industry and how efficient it was. But then, as those laws became more rigid, you wrote that, quote, the rot of protectionism became visible over time, end quote. So can you tell us that story of how it started and how it changed and became what it is now, and talk about how the Jones Act is protectionist?
Yes. So as you mentioned, the Jones Act turned 100 years old in June of last year, but it's a mistake to think that that this kind of protectionism was only 100 years old. We weren't in some free market environment prior to the Jones Act being enacted in 1920. Rather, the Jones Act was kind of a tweak to laws already on the books. And supporters of the Jones Act seize on this and they say, well, this just shows this is the wisdom of the founding fathers. And that they had similar laws on the books back from the founding of the country. What they won't tell you is that the environment and the context is just completely different between then and today. So back at the beginning of this country, there are a few things to note here. One is that, unlike today, U.S.-built ships were some of the best in the world and some of the cheapest in the world. In fact, when we were still part of the British Empire, a huge portion of the British fleet were all vessels built in the colonies, in the 13 colonies. And that's not a surprise. The 13 colonies all had a lot of waterfront. They were very maritime oriented. Of course, we didn't have highways back then. Ships were how people moved goods and people along the coast. We had a lot of forested areas, which is great for timber, which, of course, in the days of wooden ships, that was key to shipbuilding. So we had a lot of people that knew about the ocean, were good at building ships, good at sailing the ships, and they had a lot of cheap material. So also another thing to note is that back then at the beginning of the country, the United States, we were a poor country. We didn't have a huge navy like we do today. And back then, merchant ships could be converted into warships. And this is how the United States tried to mitigate the size of its small navy and make up for that, is by taking these merchant ships and adding some cannon to them, and presto, you have a ship that can go fight the British. So we just fought this war against the British, and the British, of course, were a huge naval empire, and we wanted to make sure that we would have ships in case we had to clash with the British again, as we did in 1812. So we had these measures that said that foreign ships, they could transport goods within the colonies, but they had to pay some pretty significant taxes, which was a severe deterrent. But some historians that have looked at this basically said, look, this policy was cost-free because, again, being forced to use U.S.-built and U.S. crewed ships was no big deal because we were some of the best and cheapest at it anyway. That, of course, is not the case today. And then also it's changed in that we don't rely on our merchant ships anymore to fight our naval battles for us. We don't take, our commercial ships and put some weapons on them and then turn them into Navy vessels. That doesn't happen anymore. So what happened is that over time, this protected industry became very uncompetitive. We had the switch from wooden and sailing ships to ships made of iron and steel, and that were using steam power and had engines on them. And the United States kept building these wooden ships, and the British, who got rid of their own protectionist maritime laws, they had the Industrial Revolution. They became very good at building ships, and we remained stagnant. In fact, I think as late as 1890, a majority of U.S. ships were still wooden sailing ships, even though the rest of the world had moved on to iron and steam. And so you had this. The predictable result of this is that U.S. shipping became more and more uncompetitive, more expensive, and Americans started looking for ways to get around it, any loophole. And in fact, I believe in the late 1800s, you had this absurd example of someone that wanted to ship, I think, 200 barrels of nails from New York to San Francisco or Los Angeles, one of the two, to the West Coast. And they did it through Belgium because they figured that if they went to Belgium and then Belgium back to the United States, they could avoid the U.S. laws that mandated the use of U.S. ships between U.S. ports if they put a foreign port in between. That's how expensive U.S. shipping was. It made more sense to go through Belgium. Well, this resulted in a court case, and the court said, no, Americans can do that. So Congress changed the law to prohibit the use of going through foreign ports by ship. But what some Americans found is that in the case of Alaska, if they wanted to send something to Alaska, what they could do is as long as they took it over land to a foreign port, it was permissible. So people would take things to land up to Vancouver, and then from Vancouver, they would go to Alaska. Well, guess who hated this? Shipping companies based in Seattle. And so in 1920, when Senator Wesley Jones, who was there, the senator from Seattle, was holding hearings, some of these shipping companies went to Congress and said, look, you guys are having these maritime hearings. If you really want to help us out, we got all this unfair foreign competition we'd like you to shut the door on. And the Jones Act, and they actually proposed some language and said, if you adopt this language, I think that'll eliminate Americans being able to use these foreign ships and in Vancouver going to Alaska. We want the Alaska market for ourselves. And if you look at what was adopted, if you look at the text of the Jones Act, it's incredible. It's strikingly similar to the language proposed by these shipping companies based in Seattle. And the other piece of this is, remember, Alaska was not a state at this point. It was a territory. They had no representation in Congress. They had no ability to object or fight this. So this is basically shipping companies in Seattle wanting the Alaska market to themselves, hating competition, and using their senator, Wesley Jones, of the Jones Act to keep out that competition.
Oh my gosh, that's crazy, those stories. Man, sometimes the laws are just... Anyways, I find it interesting when I was researching for this and kind of just doing my own exploration that I found that during the relief efforts to help the people of Puerto Rico recover from Hurricane Maria in September of 2017, the White House agreed to temporarily waive the Jones Act to help goods be distributed more efficiently during the relief efforts. I feel like this is an admission of guilt, maybe not guilt, but I feel like that's admitting that the Jones Act actually makes it harder and way more expensive for goods to be delivered to consumers.
It's 100% an admission. Yes. I think that's very perceptive of you. The mentality here is kind of strange to me, in that the thinking is, okay, Puerto Rico got hit by a hurricane, so they need stuff. So for 10 days, we'll take our foot off their throat and let foreign ships transport stuff, because getting stuff there as quickly as possible, as cheap as possible, is important. Well, guess what? It's important the rest of the time too, even beyond those 10 days, even before the hurricane hit. And this idea that, okay, after 10 days, let's go back to imposing these stringent laws and making it much more expensive for them to import goods, if that's all well and good, that's just a strange mentality to me. If it was good then, it should be good now. Puerto Rico, if there's talk about Puerto Rico possibly becoming a state. Well, if it does become a state, it will be the poorest U.S. state. I think by some distance, it'll be poorer than Mississippi. It has, last I checked, like a 43% poverty rate. They have to import much of what they consume by ship, and yet we subject them to some of the most expensive shipping in the world. That just doesn't seem fair to me. It doesn't seem right.
It really doesn't. I mean, this also kind of reminds me of some of the COVID waiving of laws and all the red tape with licensing and being able to practice in different states. That it just reminds me of that, if you have to get rid of the law to make it more efficient to help more people, does that not mean that the law does not help the people? I don't know. So, okay, we kind of talked a little bit about how shipping companies kind of lobbied for this legislation. But who else, what special interests support the Jones Act? Because I know that Hawaii's representatives in Congress support the Jones Act, which to me seems wild because Hawaii is also an island, which most people should know, which means that then it increases the cost of shipping goods because it's so far away. I mean, a 9-hour flight from DC, that's far. 5 hours from California, that's far away. And so on a ship, especially under the Jones Act, that must be so expensive. So who supports it, and why do these Hawaiian representatives support it, given that it does what it does?
So who supports it? Well, you won't be surprised to learn that U.S. shipbuilders support it. This, of course, is a law that says, if you want to transport something in the U.S., you need to buy what they sell. That's a home run for them. They love it. Obviously, the people that operate the ships, they support the Jones Act. And that may seem a little counterintuitive because some people think, well, this law forces them to pay extremely high prices for the ships they buy. Wouldn't they want at least to change that part of the law? But no, they don't, for a couple of reasons. One, these guys paid big bucks for the ships that they bought. Now, if tomorrow you repealed that U.S.-built requirement and let people buy ships from anywhere, well, the value of their ships would plummet. It would plummet down to world prices. So, that $250 million ship they bought, well, it would only be worth $50 million. Furthermore, high cost of buying vessels is a barrier to entry, which is great. That keeps other shipping companies out. If you look at the Hawaii market, there are only 2 shipping companies that you can choose from. It's a duopoly there. You have Pasha and Matson. That's your 2 choices. You want to ship something to Alaska? Well, you got Matson, you got Tote, 2 choices. You want to ship something to Puerto Rico? There are 2 carriers that have 85% of the market. There's Tote and Crowley. Again, duopolies just all over the place. These guys don't want to see that U.S. built requirement go away, and they don't want any competition. And then you have the unions that crew these ships. Well, they don't want foreign competition either. Yeah, there are only 96 ships, but with less competition, that means higher pay for their guys. So they don't want to lose that. So, and like you said, we have this interesting dynamic where the representatives and senators of Hawaii, with the lone exception of Representative Ed Case, who represents Honolulu, he is opposed to the Jones Act. The other 3 members of the Hawaii delegation are supporters of the Jones Act. And it's interesting, when Ed Case has been interviewed about this, you would think that opposing the Jones Act in Hawaii to be a slam dunk position. And he said, this is one of the toughest issues or stances that I've taken, which is kind of extremely counterintuitive and absurd, frankly. And then you've got Alaska, where all 3 members support the Jones Act. And this is even more strange because in 1984, there was a referendum passed by the people of Alaska, passed like 60-40. And what it did among its provisions was mandate that the governor, as one of his official duties, lobby Congress for repeal of the Jones Act. That was the expression of the will of the people of Alaska. Well, the governor of Alaska can't even get his own delegation on board. So the people spoke out, and yet they support the Jones Act. Why? Well, if you look at Senator Dan Sullivan of Alaska's website, his campaign website, he was reelected last year. He featured endorsements from, I think, something like 20 or 21 groups. 4 or 5 of those, so roughly a quarter of them, were all Jones Act supporting groups. So basically, when people walk into the voting booth, the people that care about the Jones Act tend to be those that support it, the people that make it a litmus test. And lots of people don't like it, but it's not a make or break issue for them, or it doesn't play a decisive role in who they vote for, and that gets reflected in our politics. There are a few people that profit handsomely from it, and they make that their signature issue, and they reward or punish politicians based on their stance. Whereas most people, they don't like it. In fact, last year there was a poll in Hawaii that showed out of people aware of the law in Hawaii, 85% favored either repealing or reforming the law, and yet, we have the status quo where the political establishment is against reform.
And it's also of the people aware of it, which indicates that, I don't know. I mean, I'm young. I'm still learning about everything there is that exists. I mean, I feel like you do that for your whole life, but
you do. I think, trust me.
I feel like the fact that it's something. Okay, so I guess my question is, how does it affect the everyday American, and how does it affect the people of Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and Alaska in comparison to how it affects like people on the mainland?
I would say, a common perception of the Jones Act is people think, well, it's a bad law, but really, frankly, that's a problem for like three places, like Alaska, Hawaii, Guam, and Puerto Rico. So really not a problem for the rest of the country. And I think that's a mistake for a few reasons. One reason I think we have that mentality is we don't know the opportunities being missed because we've never existed in a world without the Jones Act, right? We don't know what changes there would be and what opportunities would present themselves if we didn't have this law. I mean, for example, right now here on the East Coast, if you want to send something from, a container of goods from, Boston to Miami by ship, you can't do it. I mean, there are no U.S. Jones Act compliant container ships that operate along the East Coast. But that's not the end of the world because you can use a truck, you can use rail, you have alternatives. But in a non-Jones Act world, I think we would have more opportunities and different alternatives that would become available. There would be new ways of doing things. There would be new innovation. I think just a whole new world would open up to itself that would reduce the cost of transportation. It would take more, trucks and traffic off our highways. It would mean less highway maintenance. It would be less crowded highways. Again, there'd be environmental benefits for all of us if we had more goods being moved by ship. Also, it's useful to remember that the Jones Act is a trade barrier. The United States is a huge country. I mean, we are a country that stretches from the Aleutian Islands of Alaska all the way to Puerto Rico and to Hawaii and to Maine and everywhere in between. And distance is a barrier to trade, and having cheap, efficient transport is a means of overcoming that trade barrier and doing business with each other. And if we had cheap, efficient shipping, we could do more business with each other. And then lastly, I'll point out that not only is it a trade barrier in that it drives up the cost of transportation, the Jones Act is a trade barrier in the classic sense, and that when the United States negotiates free trade agreements with other countries, one thing we always do is we take the Jones Act off the table. We say that's not up for discussion. And it doesn't matter who we're talking to. In our very first FTA with Canada, we refused to talk about the Jones Act. So our trade partners then variably respond by saying, well, that thing that you guys want, well, you're not getting it either. So that means reduced opportunities for American exporters. And then lastly, I mentioned to you before about how the Jones Act incentivizes the purchase of foreign products instead of American products. Well, you may be someone in Kansas or on the coast, and you don't care that much about the Jones Act because, again, you have access to truck and rail. Jones Act is not the end of the world. But maybe that means someone in Puerto Rico or Hawaii or Alaska is not buying your product who otherwise would buy your product because, again, they're buying the foreign product because the Jones Act makes it unattractive, just price prohibitive to buy the American product, the one that you're trying to sell. So I definitely think it's a mistake to think that this is a Alaska, Hawaii, Guam, Puerto Rico problem. It's very much an American problem, and I think all Americans should be opposed to it.
Yeah, I mean, that makes it so real. I mean, I knew that it kind of posed a problem because I would think about, when I'm driving on the highway, it scares me to see those big, scary trucks, and if they weren't there, wouldn't that be so nice? That's how I've always kind of thought of it. But really, it's true. That would be better for the roads. It would be better for, I don't know, better for me. I wouldn't be scared to drive on the road with the big trucks. And if it's cost efficient and makes it faster and or gives people alternatives and is safe for the environment comparatively, I don't know, it just sounds pretty nice.
Yeah.
So, okay, let's talk about some arguments when people argue for the Jones Act. So some people say that the Jones Act, quote, provides stability to the U.S. maritime industry and helps to sustain 650,000 American jobs, resulting in $150 billion in economic benefits each year, end quote. What do you say to that?
A few things. So the idea that provides stability is false. I mentioned that there are 96 Jones Act ships today. Back in the early 1950s, there were well over 400 of those ships. Now, granted, ships have gotten bigger, so you can do more with one ship than you could before. But even in terms of the amount of stuff that they're capable of transporting, the Jones Act fleet's been on a decline for the last 30 or 40 years. I think 40 years. So it hasn't provided stability. The number of jobs is that 650,000 figure that you quoted. That's according to a report paid for by the Jones Act lobby by, I believe, is the Transportation Institute, which, if you look on Google Maps, is actually located in a parking lot that belongs to the Seafarers International Union. This, anyway, it's a report that they've never made public. Like, if you go Googling for this report and try to download a copy, you won't find it. I was able to find the executive summary of this paper on the Shipbuilders Council of America website. And after I posted it on Twitter, they immediately yanked it off their website. They don't want people seeing their stuff, evidently. And if you actually read the executive summary, it says that the amount of actual direct jobs in the entire Jones Act industry is less than 100,000. I think it's 95,000. Well, wow. back in the mid 1990s, these guys were talking about, we have 125,000 people employed in the Jones Act directly. And even, I think 5 years ago, they were talking about, the Jones Act provides 500,000 jobs, and now it's up to 650,000 jobs, even as the fleet has gotten smaller. I mean, the math is just, it's hocus pocus. It's not believable. And we know it's not believable because if it was, they would make the reports public so they could be scrutinized. These are nonsense figures that they peddle and which in turn are repeated by politicians. So I think that there's really no truth to any of the talking points contained in that passage.
You heard it here. Do not repeat things that people say without looking for the first source, with the primary source first. I don't know. I feel like I try. I mean, I know it's hard. I try to do it myself as much as I can, and when I can't, I just try not to cite numbers because. First, I don't know, just I don't want to be the person that's citing a report that no one can find on the internet. But I don't know, it makes me think of, okay, so we went to Georgia like a few weeks ago and there was a ship, I mean, you probably heard about it in 2019 that capsized with 4,000 Hyundais on it.
Yes.
And so recently I made the connection, that ship first probably was an American ship. I mean, I didn't look into it, but probably was. Maybe not, but
it was not. It was
really?
I believe it was I know it was a South Korean crewed ship. It was called the Golden Ray, I believe. Yeah, it was containing it was a car carrying ship. Yeah, there are no Jones Act ships that are pure car carriers like that. In the fleet.
Yeah, but I was just thinking about it and I was like, do they count the jobs that it takes to get rid of the ship? They're still pulling it apart. It's still there.
Yeah.
They couldn't figure out whose job it was to get rid of it, so it's still in the ocean. And it just does not look good, but also it's more than half of it is still there, I think. So slow moving, but I wonder if those are the sort of jobs that they count under this, because I don't think that counts. Okay, so
I can't say because again they don't really release the full version of the report, so you can't break it down, see how they arrive at these numbers that they have in the executive summary. So I can't help you out, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's just so frustrating because how are you? I don't know how. That's just not honest. It's very slimy and not clear. Yeah. So what do you say to the argument that the Jones Act advances our national security by helping maintain a vibrant domestic shipbuilding industry and maritime workforce?
Well, the U.S. shipbuilding industry is anything but vibrant when it comes to commercial shipbuilding. According to the Congressional Research Service, in an average typical year, 2 or 3 ships are built. To put that in context, I don't mean per shipyard. I mean, that's the entire country put together, all the shipyards. If you look at, to put that in context, a single shipyard in South Korea can build 50 ships in a year. Just that one shipyard. I don't mean all of South Korea. I mean a single shipyard.
Wow.
Last year, American shipyards delivered 1 ship. This year, they're supposed to deliver 2. Next year, 0. So there's barely any commercial shipbuilding taking place, particularly when we're talking about these large ocean-going ships. Yeah, we do build tugboats and ferries and smaller things like that, but large ocean-going ships, not very many at all. That number has been trending downward. And so when it comes to shipbuilding, it's very hard to make that case. If the argument is we need the Jones Act to assure that we have lots of shipyards, well, we don't. What's driving U.S. shipbuilding is not the Jones Act. To the extent we still have shipbuilding in this country, it's all government contracts. It's building for the Navy. It's building for the Coast Guard. It's building for, the NOAA, National Oceanographic and Atmosphere Administration, things like this, state and local government, ferries for the, state of Washington ferry system, things like that. In 2015, there was a report from the U.S. Maritime Administration that said that government contracts were 70% of shipbuilding revenue. And that was actually kind of low. I've seen previous estimates back in the 80s at one point. It was like 91% of all revenue. And other points it's been 80%. So, most U.S. shipbuilding is dependent on the government, not on building these commercial ships for the Jones Act fleet.
Also, I don't remember what war it was, but we asked Russia for ships because ours were all outdated, and they said no. Of course,
so
that shows you how desperate we were.
You're referring to the Persian Gulf War, of 1990. This is a situation where Iraq invaded Kuwait, and there were concerns that they were going to continue on and invade Saudi Arabia, and we needed to get as much and as many soldiers and their equipment and supplies to Saudi Arabia as quickly as possible. And this is kind of the situation that the Jones Act was tailor-made for, right? I mean, the whole point of the Jones Act is that in these situations, we have lots of ships and lots of mariners to crew those ships. And that was absolutely not the case. We had to use a lot of foreign ships. I think something like 170 foreign ships were chartered to carry equipment and supplies for our soldiers. Again, as you mentioned, we were so desperate for ships. We actually went to the Soviet Union twice and asked them to borrow one of theirs. Not only were we short of ships, we were also short of mariners to crew those ships. In fact, we would have had a shortage, but fortunately, in January of 1990, the Great Lakes froze over, and so all the guys that work on some of the ships in the Great Lakes were able to crew some of the ships. But they still had to use lots of retirees, veterans of the Vietnam War, the Korean War, World War II. There are guys in their 60s, 70s. There are a few guys in their 80s. There was one guy who was 92 years old that was used to crew one of these ships. So the law, I think if you think, well, we need the Jones Act for shipbuilding. Well, no, it's a total failure. If we need the Jones Act to assure we have lots of ships, no, we don't. And that's was 30 years ago. The fleet's only gotten smaller. Do we need the Jones Act to assure we have lots of mariners? Well, no, we don't have those either. So what are we doing here?
That is an excellent point. And let the poor guy rest. They're old. They fought their war for you. I don't know. That really bothers me. Poor 92-year-old man. Hopefully they paid him well. I don't know. Probably not. So what do you say to people who claim that, quote, we depend too heavily upon foreign shipping in global trade, with 97% of all U.S. overseas commerce being conducted by foreign flagged carriers, and losing the Jones Act would mean ceding our domestic maritime economy to China or other foreign flag competitors, making us more vulnerable during times of crisis, end quote.
Well, I think we've already, as you point out, we're already dependent on foreigners for the majority of our maritime trade. If you think the Jones Act keeps us dependent or free of foreign dependence, you're absolutely wrong. As I mentioned before, what the Jones Act does is it deters the use of American shipping and buying American products. So again, Puerto Rico, so instead of, absent the Jones Act, we would probably have foreign ships transporting American products from the U.S. mainland, say, to Puerto Rico. But instead, what we have is people using foreign ships to take a foreign product from a foreign port to Puerto Rico. If you're concerned about foreigners, I'm not. But if you're one of those types of people, that's not an improved situation. We've had examples in New England and Puerto Rico of liquefied natural gas being imported from Russia to those places because, New England can't, again, there are no Jones Act ships to transport the LNG from other parts of the United States. So they have to turn to foreign sources, including on a few occasions, Russia. That doesn't seem like an improvement to me. If you're concerned about China, according to the Department of Agriculture, we've seen increased imports of rice from China to Puerto Rico. And according to the Department of Agriculture's website, it says there are two main reasons. One is the rice is cheap in China, and two, you factor in the cost of transportation. It specifically says the Jones Act is a deterrent to buying rice from the southeastern United States, like Arkansas, which actually is a fairly significant rice producer. So the Jones Act, again, is a law that encourages more foreign reliance and buying more foreign products, if that's the kind of thing you're concerned about. But then also, let's look at that foreign trade. Again, like you said, Americans use foreign ships for something like 98 or 98.5% of all of the products that we export and import. And for the most part, it's worked out pretty well. There are no documented terrorist incidents of we have foreign ships in our ports all the time. Haven't had any security incidents. You did mention the Golden Ray, which sank down in, I can't remember if it was Georgia or South Carolina, car carrier. But, we've had we've had mishaps with Jones Act ships as well. There was a Jones Act ship that sank in 2015 called the El Faro. It was a 40-year-old ship that sank in a hurricane on the way to Puerto Rico. Back in, what was it, 1989, we had the Exxon Valdez, one of the most notorious environmental disasters in American history. That was a Jones Act ship.
Oh, God.
So this idea that, use American and there's no downside and that we're protected from any sort of mishaps, that's absolutely a misconception.
And it's like this was meant to promote using American, but really it just not only deters other companies and countries, but like it deters consumers from having the cheapest product, because if natural gas is in the United States and you want that, sucks, you can't have it. It costs more. But then also for producers, it just seems to suck for everyone. So even by its own standard, the Jones Act has failed and continues to fail. Do you see any real prospect of getting rid of it?
It's very difficult. I think getting rid of it, just straight repeal of the law, I think will be incredibly difficult. Right now, the Jones Act is, according to the World Economic Forum, the world's most restrictive example of a cabotage law. So, cabotage laws are laws that govern who can transport goods within a country. And lots of countries have cabotage laws. There are very few countries that say, okay, any ship, no matter where you're from, you can transport goods within our country. The EU does have permissive cabotage. For example, among EU members, you can use ships from any country. But within those cabotage laws, the Jones Act is, according to the World Economic Forum, the world's most restrictive example of a cabotage law. So we're not going to go from one extreme of having the world's most restrictive cabotage law to no cabotage law. But I do think that there are opportunities, or at least there should be opportunities, for some reforms, some steps in the right direction. For example, when it comes to these large ocean-going ships, we barely build any. We're protecting an industry that barely exists. We should stop doing that. Why don't you say, Americans, hey, we haven't built that. I mentioned there are LNG carriers in the Jones Act fleet. We haven't even built one in this country in over 40 years. Why don't you just let Americans buy a foreign one? If it's that's not a business that we're engaged in. So start with that U.S. built requirement and take a look at that. Also, the 75% ownership rule that strikes me as fairly absurd and unjustifiable. I think there are some common sense ways of moving us forward that would produce gains not only for American consumers, but for the American maritime industry itself. It's a really insane approach to say, okay, this is a law that's going to promote the U.S. merchant marine and our maritime industry. And the way we're going to do that is by forcing people to pay 5 times the price for ships. I mean, that sounds like an idiotic way of trying to, improve your maritime industry. I mean, imagine if we took that logic and applied it to aerospace and our airlines and said, okay, Delta, American Airlines, you guys got to pay. We're going to raise the price of your airplanes by a factor of 5. What would that do to that industry? It's absolute insanity. So I think that's, to the extent that there's hope for reform and revisions, I think it's looking at that U.S. built requirement. I also think it's high time that we look at, again, Puerto Rico. The entire logic for the Jones Act is that by putting these restrictions, it would ensure that we would have these ships and mariners that we can use in times of war. Well, even if you accept that logic and think that that's a sound way of doing things, basically it says, well, this national security good, the ability to transport equipment and supplies anywhere in the world, well, that's going to be paid for mainly by the people who use ships, which is, again, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, Alaska. So this tiny percentage of the population has to pay for the bill for this good that's supposed to benefit all of us. It's supposed to be for national security. And that just strikes me as grossly unfair, and particularly to put it on some of the poorest Americans in the country. That's obscene. And that should be changed. So, and then, we could give, say, Puerto Rico an exemption to the Jones Act and then use that as a test case, and we could be incremental about it. And after 5 years, 10 years, study the effects and see what's happened and then move on from there. But I think the unfortunate reality is the Jones Act lobby and those who support the law are scared to death of something like that because they know what the findings would be. And it would be just a lot of improvement, major cost savings, new efficiencies, and there'd be no looking back.
It's America, the land of the free, except we have the most restrictive cabotage law. I learned a new word today. I don't know.
And you bring up a good point. I mean, we talk a lot about economics and costs and national security. And also, I think part of this conversation, we should step back at some point and go, you know what? This is the land of the free. As a free person, I should be able to use a foreign ship to transport goods within the United States. At a minimum, I should be able to buy a ship from any country I want as a free person. That's something I should be able to do. And I think that gets lost sometimes and overlooked.
Yeah, no, you're definitely right. I was kind of just saying that to say that, but it is a very good point, and it's something to think about. I don't know. Thank you so much. So to wrap up, what is one thing you believed at one time in your life that you later changed your position on, and why?
Well, there's a lot to choose from here. Any number of issues I could draw upon, but something that I've been thinking a lot about lately is something that I got spectacularly wrong was the impact of the internet on news and politics. I really thought back in the late 90s or so, when the internet started to become a big time thing, it would be this unalloyed good by democratizing access to information and even the ability to create information. And we would no longer be beholden to this relatively small group of media gatekeepers who controlled the news. People could just go out and look for the truth, and bias would be punished. That was really naive. In fact, what I've learned and what experience has shown is that people love bias. Most people don't want the truth. What people want is information that confirms their biases and preconceived notions about how the world works. It feels good to have people say, you know that thing you thought? Well, you're right once again. Having your beliefs challenged is highly uncomfortable and discombobulating. People with a truly open mind who just don't go along with the rest of the herd are a pretty rare commodity. And I'm concerned about what the internet has done to our politics and the way we converse with one another and how siloed we've become. And it's something I just totally missed because I truly didn't understand human nature very well, and I probably still don't.
I don't think any of us do, so you're not alone. Thank you for sharing. That's all the time we have for today. I'd like to thank Colin once again for his time and insight on this issue. I also would like to thank everybody who listens, subscribes, and shares the Great Antidote podcast. If you would like to be on the podcast, or if you have a guest in mind, please feel free to reach out to me at thegreatantidote@thecgo.org. Thank you. Bye.